Hey everyone, and welcome back. This is one of a series of lectures looking at public policy in the context of American and California politics. In this video, we're going to look at the California state budget process. California's economy is huge. Its 2023 gross domestic product, the total value of goods and services produced in the state that year, was more than $3.75 billion. The next closest state, Texas, had a total GDP that year of about $2.4 billion, and from there, New York, Florida, Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Ohio follow. Another way to think about that is that California represents about 15% of the total economic activity of the United States. Texas comprises about 8.7%, New York about 8.1%, and so on. Another way to really comprehend the size of California's economy is to place it in the scope of the world's largest economies. At the national level, the United States has the world's largest economy with a total GDP of just under $25 trillion. China places second with a total GDP of about $17.7 trillion, with Japan, Germany, India, the United Kingdom, France, and Italy rounding out the top 8. But if California were placed in this ranking, it would displace India as the world's 5th largest economy, knocking Italy out of the top 8 altogether. So California's economy is truly massive, and so is its state budget. But how is the state budget allocated? Where does the money come from? Where does it go? And how is all of that decided? That's what we're going to explore in this video. By law, the California state budget, like the budgets of nearly every state in the country, must balance. That is to say, state spending cannot generally exceed state revenues. California state tax revenue comes from a variety of sources, but personal income taxes represents the single largest share, comprising nearly 2/3 of all tax revenue raised. California's income tax structure is highly progressive, with the top 1% of income earners paying about 45% of all personal income taxes collected by the state. This includes capital gains taxes, that is, taxes paid on the income earned from the stock market and other investments, which makes up about 15% of total state revenue. But the combination of reliance on capital gains taxes and taxes on high-income individuals makes California's budget subject to greater fluctuations, usually corresponding with changes in the overall market conditions in the United States. Thus, when the U.S. economy is doing well, California often experiences boom years in state revenue. But when the U.S. economy struggles, California often experiences sharp declines in state revenue. To counteract this overall trend, California maintains a budget stabilization fund, often called a rainy day fund, into which the state puts a portion of tax revenue collected every year and from which the state can draw on in economic downturns. The other major sources of state revenue include sales tax and use taxes, which comprise about 16% of state tax revenue, corporate taxes, which comprise about 10% of state tax revenue, and all other taxes, which at the state level comprise a little less than 5% of revenue. It's also important to note that these figures are for state-level taxes only. At the county and local level, property taxes and sales taxes represent the most important sources of revenue for city and county governments. On the spending side, the single largest expense for the state is K-12 education. Under the requirements established by Prop 98 in 1988, the state is required to spend about 38% of general fund revenue on K-12 and community college education. When translated into the overall state budget, this means that K-14 education generally comprises more than 1/3 of total state spending. Spending on higher education, the University of California and the California State University systems, represents about 11% of the state budget, meaning that spending on education in total represents a little less than half of the total state budget. The second largest component of the state budget is spending on health, including spending on Medi-Cal, the state's Medicaid program, the Department of Health, and other healthcare spending, which comprises about 1/4 of the state budget. Human services, which includes spending on a variety of social services, including food assistance programs, child welfare and child care, and related spending, comprises a little less than 10% of spending. Spending on the Department of Corrections and corrections-related programs consumes about 8% of the state budget, and spending on all other programs represents about 12% of the state budget. I'll provide a link to the California State Legislative Analyst's Office if you'd like to explore the California state budget in greater detail. But how is the state budget decided? That is, what's the process by which the state adopts spending priorities? It's a complicated process. The state's fiscal year begins July 1st and ends June 30th of the following year. By law, the state legislature must adopt a budget no later than June 15th of each year, though that deadline is not infrequently missed. The annual budget process begins in January when the governor releases a proposed budget for the upcoming fiscal year. The state constitution requires the governor submit a balanced budget proposal to each house of the legislature by January 10th. That budget proposal outlines the governor's spending priorities and revenue estimates and serves as a starting point for budget discussions and negotiations moving forward. After the governor presents the budget, a budget bill is introduced into both chambers of the state legislature and is referred to both the Assembly Budget Committee and the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee. Both committees conduct hearings which provide an opportunity for witnesses to testify and for the legislature to question agency heads and other government officials as part of the legislative process. These hearings provide an opportunity for legislators to make adjustments and modifications to the budget proposal. By the end of February, the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office, or LAO, provides their analysis and detailed review of the proposed budget, which is published and made public under the Analysis of the Budget Bill document. That document includes individual department findings and recommendations for legislative action. At the same time, a companion document called Perspectives and Issues provides an economic forecast of the state's fiscal status, anticipated economic conditions and tax revenues, and identifies some of the key policy issues for the legislature. Together, these two documents frame the debate in the state legislature, and the LAO staff works with the various state legislative committees throughout the budget process. During the legislative process, the Assembly Budget Committee and the Senate Budget and Fiscal Review Committee review and debate various items in the budget, primarily through the work of their various subcommittees, each of which has jurisdiction over specific programmatic areas. For example, education, health and human services, transportation, state services, and so on. The various subcommittees may approve, reject, or make amendments to spending priorities in their respective areas, ultimately approving a budget recommendation in their respective areas, which collectively comprise the Senate and Assembly budget bills. In May, the governor submits a revision of the January proposed budget known as the May Revise. The May Revise updates projected general fund and other tax revenues and is used by the governor to update spending proposals for the upcoming fiscal year based on new data. The governor's May Revise proposals must be adopted by the legislature during the subcommittee process, and each house retains the discretion to make adjustments in these proposals. Because these Assembly and Senate processes take place simultaneously but largely independent of one another and begin before the May Revise is even submitted, the Senate and Assembly budgets often begin to diverge both from the governor's original proposal but also from one another as the legislative process unfolds. To reconcile the different proposed budgets, a conference committee is formed. The conference committee generally consists of 3 state senators and 3 state assembly members, in both cases generally comprised of 2 members from the majority party and 1 from the minority party in each chamber. The conference committee goes through each budget item in which there's a difference in funding levels between the state assembly and the state senate, and must vote either to adopt the assembly or senate version for each of these items. In recent years, the conference committee has conducted an open conference, meaning all budget items, even those on which the Assembly and Senate took the same action, may be reviewed and adjusted by the committee. Throughout the process, the conference committee works closely with the administration officials to reconcile the differences and create a budget that's acceptable to both the legislature and the governor. When the conference committee work is done and the differences between the 2 budget proposals have been resolved, the draft budget is sent back to the state assembly and the state senate, each of which must pass the final revised budget by a simple majority vote. After the legislature has approved the budget, it is sent to the governor for final approval. The governor can sign the bill, may reject or veto it, or may use the line item veto power to reduce or eliminate specific expenditures or budget language from the budget, a process sometimes called blue penciling. The state constitution allows the governor to eliminate and or reduce items in an appropriation bill containing appropriations while approving other portions of the same bill. But any items vetoed by the governor can be reconsidered separately or overridden by the legislature by a 2/3 majority vote. Once the governor has approved the budget, it goes into law and state agencies and departments begin implementing the approved spending plan for the next fiscal year. Funds are allocated to various programs and services based on the budget's provision. But even after it's approved, state officials continue to monitor revenue collections and expenditures to ensure that the budget remains balanced. If there are significant revenue shortfalls or unexpected expenses, adjustments may be made through budgetary mechanisms like budget trailer bills, which are used to adjust spending mid-year. The budget process also contains various oversight mechanisms, including audits conducted by the California State Auditor, which aim to ensure transparency and accountability in the use of taxpayer funds. Creating a budget for an economy as large as the state of California can be a challenge in the best of times, but a number of challenges make it even more difficult. First, California has a history of structural budget deficits, where ongoing spending commitments exceed recurring revenue sources. This results in the need to address budget shortfalls regularly, undermining the state's ability to invest in critical services and infrastructure. Complicating these structural deficits, the state is also highly dependent on personal income taxes, particularly from high-income earners and capital gains. As we've previously considered, this dependency leads to revenue volatility, as the state's finances are heavily influenced by economic cycles and fluctuations in the stock market. The state also faces substantial unfunded liabilities, particularly in pension and retiree healthcare costs for public employees. Addressing these liabilities while maintaining essential services is a budgetary challenge, particularly as population growth in the state begins to slow. A significant portion of the budget is dedicated to mandatory spending, including K-12 education and healthcare, leaving fewer discretionary funds for other priorities. Meeting the needs of these programs while balancing the budget is challenging, and the problem is exacerbated by the state's initiative process, which empowers voters to direct state resources to specific purposes, limiting the flexibility of the legislature to address various competing budget priorities. Many of these spending requirements, such as minimum guarantees for K-12 education and healthcare spending, have been enshrined by voters into the state constitution, meaning the legislature cannot alter spending levels outside of a few narrowly defined situations. At the same time, California has substantial infrastructure needs, including transportation, water, and housing. Addressing these needs requires significant investment, which can strain state budgets. More recently, natural disasters like wildfires and earthquakes have increased emergency spending in the state, unexpectedly straining the state's budget. While the legislature has sought to allocate additional resources to emergency preparedness and disaster relief, other competing priorities also exist, making allocating scarce resources difficult. And finally, a number of longer-term trends threatens the state's financial position. Climate change threatens to exacerbate wildfires in the states, and rising sea levels threaten coastal communities and strain state resources. A slowdown in the state's population growth rate, combined with outmigration to other states, may impact state revenue, requiring the budget process to adapt as well. And an aging population also creates spending challenges in terms of growing pensions and healthcare spending obligations, as well as declining tax revenue. California is also unique in the way in which direct democracy, primarily through the use of ballot initiatives and referendums, has a significant impact on the state budget and budget process. As we've already mentioned, California's initiative and referendum process, which we explore in another video, allows citizens to propose and vote on laws and constitutional amendments directly, often bypassing the state legislature. This means that voters can directly influence the state budgetary decisions by approving or rejecting measures that have financial implications. This has taken several forms over time. Many initiatives propose changes to the state's tax structure, permitting voters to approve or reject measures that create new taxes, modify existing taxes, or set specific revenue earmarks for certain programs. Examples of this include Proposition 30, which temporarily increased personal income tax on high-income earners, and Prop 13, which limited increases in property tax levels, effectively limiting funding growth for city and local governments and leading to a shift in reliance on state funding for K-12 education and other local services. Other initiatives create spending mandates or allocate specific percentages of the state budget to particular programs or purposes, limiting the flexibility of the state legislature to allocate revenue. Examples here include Prop 98, which established minimum funding guarantees for K-12 education and community colleges based on a formula tied to general fund revenues and school attendance, effectively ensuring a significant portion of state revenue, generally about 1/3 of the total state budget, goes to K-12 and community college education. Prop 63, also known as the Mental Health Services Act, imposed a 1% tax on personal income over $1 million to fund mental health programs, earmarking funding for specific mental health services and impacting the budgetary allocation in these areas. California voters are often asked to approve bond measures which fund infrastructure and other projects. Bond measures proposed by the state legislature and approved by the voters permit the state to borrow money on bond markets, increasing the state's level of indebtedness. They also require the state to allocate future budget revenue for debt servicing, increasing revenue for specific projects but encumbering future revenue for debt servicing. And even when voters are not passing initiative referenda or bond measures directly related to the state budget, the policy decisions voters make through the direct democracy process can still affect the budget. As a result, the Secretary of State is required to provide a budget assessment for all proposed ballot measures, informing voters of the potential fiscal consequences of any changes. For example, a measure to reform criminal justice policy to expand access to parole may reduce state spending on corrections, while a measure to expand access to healthcare for children may increase state spending on healthcare, any of which could affect future state spending levels. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching. Bye.